An ordinary school story turned into a nightmare. Bullies tormented a girl and tied her to a tree, but no one expected who would come to her rescue at the most critical moment. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching us from. The move had come faster than anyone expected. For months, Chuck Norris had been trying to step away from the spotlight of films, television interviews, and endless questions about his martial arts legacy. He wanted a quieter life, a place where his family could breathe without the weight of celebrity pressing down on them. The small town they chose seemed like the perfect solution. Nestled between rolling hills and lined with narrow streets where people still greeted one another by name, it promised the sense of community and safety every parent hoped for. To Chuck, it looked like a chance to let his daughter grow up without cameras or gossip, just as an ordinary girl in an ordinary school. Dakota sat in the back seat of the SUV, her forehead leaning against the cool glass of the window as her father turned into the town's main street. Rows of weathered houses stood like old sentinels, their porches decorated with flags or rocking chairs. The kind of place where time seemed to move slower than in the city. Her mother smiled at her in the mirror, but Dakota only nodded in response, her stomach already in knots. New schools had always been difficult for her, but this one felt different. She was older now, not a child who could blend in easily. She was 16, with her own style, her own voice, and a last name that carried more weight than she wanted. When they pulled up in front of Riverside High School, the parking lot was already buzzing with cars and clusters of students. Chuck parked near the entrance and turned to face his daughter. His eyes were calm but firm, the kind of eyes that had stared down opponents in arenas and enemies in darker corners of the world. "Stand tall," he reminded her, his voice steady, "and don't forget who you are." "I know, Dad," Dakota replied quietly, though her heart was racing. She took a deep breath, pushed open the car door, and stepped into the whirlwind of laughter, chatter, and the clatter of lockers. For a moment she stood there, scanning the groups of students scattered around the entrance. Already she could see the invisible lines dividing them. Athletes clustered together in their Letterman jackets, cheerleaders with bright smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, loners leaning against the wall with their headphones, and smaller groups who carried themselves with nervous caution. The first bell rang, and she made her way inside. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint mixed with a sharp tang of disinfectant, a reminder that the school tried to keep up appearances. Teachers' voices echoed as they ushered stragglers toward their classrooms. Dakota found her way to the main office, where a secretary with reading glasses perched on her nose handed her a schedule and pointed her toward her first class. "English, room 203, second floor. Mrs. Thompson," she said curtly before returning to her paperwork. As Dakota entered the classroom, the low murmur of conversation dropped for a second. Every eye turned to her, curiosity sparking in the silence. She walked with deliberate calm toward an empty seat near the middle, her back straight the way her father had taught her. Mrs. Thompson, a tall woman with warm eyes, smiled. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself?" Dakota stood, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My name is Dakota Norris. My family just moved here from Dallas." A ripple of whispers swept across the room. A few students raised their eyebrows. Others smirked knowingly. And then came the laugh, sharp and mocking, from the back of the room. 4 boys lounged at their desks, radiating the kind of confidence that came from years of unchecked arrogance. The one in the center leaned forward, his blonde hair perfectly styled, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Norris, huh? Like the old guy who kicks people on TV?" His voice dripped with condescension, loud enough for the whole class to hear. The teacher's eyes narrowed. "Brandon Hayes, that's enough." He raised his hands in mock surrender, the smirk never leaving his face. "Just welcoming her, ma'am." But the laughter from his friends Kyle, with the wiry frame and sharp eyes, Trevor with his calculating silence, and Mason with shoulders too broad for his desk, made it clear that welcome wasn't the intention. Dakota sat down again, her cheeks burning, but she refused to drop her gaze. Instead, she focused on her notebook, her pen moving steadily as though she hadn't heard a thing. The morning dragged on in a blur. Every class brought the same uneasy pattern. The 4 boys appearing wherever she went, their voices low but biting, their smirks impossible to ignore. In chemistry, Kyle accidentally brushed her books onto the floor. In history, Trevor muttered about keeping things pure just loud enough for her to hear. Mason cracked his knuckles and grinned whenever she walked past. Each incident was small, easy for a teacher to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern, a clear message that she was being marked. By lunch, Dakota carried her tray cautiously, her eyes scanning the cafeteria for a safe place to sit. She spotted a table near the window, empty and isolated, and made her way toward it. Whispers followed her like shadows, and though a few students glanced her way with sympathy, none dared approach. Across the room, Brandon's group watched her like predators eyeing prey, their laughter exaggerated, their gestures designed to humiliate from afar. She set her tray down, unwrapped her sandwich, and tried to focus on eating, but the food turned to ash in her mouth. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. A message from her father. "How's the first day going?" She hesitated, her thumbs hovering over the keyboard. She could tell him the truth about the stares, the whispers, the smirks that cut deeper than any blade. But instead she typed, "It's fine, just getting used to it." Her father would know the difference. He always did. But for now, she needed to convince herself as much as him that she could handle it. The afternoon passed in the same rhythm. Brandon's taunts, his friends' sneers, the silence of teachers who saw more than they admitted. When the final bell rang, Dakota gathered her things quickly, eager to escape. But the moment she reached the front doors, Brandon stepped into her path. His shoulder slammed into hers with deliberate force, sending her stumbling. "Welcome to Riverside," he said, his smirk spreading wider as his friends laughed. Her hands clenched into fists inside her pockets, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She straightened, walked past him, and forced her steps to remain steady, even though her legs trembled. Outside, the sun shone too brightly, mocking the darkness roiling inside her. She spotted her father's SUV waiting in the pickup line. Relief swept through her as she climbed in, closing the door firmly behind her. "How was it?" Chuck asked, his voice gentle. She managed a small smile. "Just another first day." He studied her face for a moment, as though searching for the truth behind her words, then nodded. "Remember what I always tell you. Stand tall. Think clear," she finished, her smile fading as her gaze drifted back toward the school. Behind those walls, the first cracks had already begun to form. She could feel it in the way Brandon's eyes had lingered on her, in the weight of his smirk, in the silence of those who refused to intervene. She had only been in Riverside High for one day, but she already knew this was not going to be easy. And though she walked away with her head held high, deep inside she could sense the storm gathering, waiting for the moment to break. The SUV rolled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the clusters of students still laughing in the afternoon sun. For Dakota, the warmth of the light couldn't touch the chill that had settled in her chest. This was only the beginning. The next morning dawned pale and cold, the kind of morning that seemed to seep into one's bones, no matter how tightly the jacket was pulled around the shoulders. Dakota sat silently in the passenger seat while her father drove her to school. The radio played a soft country tune, but neither of them paid much attention to it. Chuck glanced at his daughter now and then, reading the set of her jaw, the way her fingers twisted together in her lap. He wanted to ask again if everything was all right, if the first day had left her unsettled, but he could see the answer in her silence. Years of martial discipline had taught him that sometimes the best way to show strength was to give space, to let another person find their footing. When they pulled into the parking lot, students were already gathering in their usual clusters. Dakota inhaled deeply before stepping out of the car. "I'll pick you up at 3, Chuck said softly. She nodded and gave him a quick smile before walking toward the building, her backpack slung tightly over her shoulder. The SUV remained in the lot for a few moments after she disappeared inside, Chuck's sharp eyes following her until she was lost in the crowd. Only then did he drive away, though not without a pang of unease settling in his chest. Inside the school, the air carried the same mix of chatter and noise as the day before, but the energy around Dakota had changed. Students' eyes lingered longer on her as she passed, whispers moving quickly through the hallways. She kept her back straight, repeating her father's words in her head like a mantra. Stand tall, think clear, but it became harder to maintain when she reached her locker and found the word loser scrawled across it in permanent marker. She paused, staring at it for a long moment, before quietly opening the locker and pulling out her books. The snickering from down the hall told her exactly who was responsible. Brandon leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, Kyle and Trevor on either side, Mason looming just behind them. Brandon gave a mock bow. "Looks better now, don't you think?" Dakota ignored him, refusing to let the heat of shame rise to her cheeks. She shut the locker with a steady hand and walked away. The laughter followed her, sharp and grating. In chemistry class, she found herself paired with Kyle at the lab table. His smirk never faded as they measured solutions, and at one point his elbow slipped, knocking her notebook into a beaker of water. The pages bled ink, her careful notes dissolving into smudges. "Oops," he said with a grin. "Guess you'll have to start over." The teacher glanced up, frowning, but when Kyle flashed an innocent smile, the teacher looked back at his computer screen. Dakota pressed her lips together, rescuing what she could of the notebook, her fingers trembling as she turned the soggy pages. By lunch, she carried her tray with mechanical precision, her eyes sweeping the cafeteria for somewhere safe. She chose an empty table in the corner again, but the sense of isolation pressed heavier this time. She watched groups of students laugh and share stories, the normal rhythm of teenage life that seemed out of reach for her. Across the room, Brandon's table erupted in loud laughter as he pantomimed tripping and falling, a cruel imitation of her stumble from the day before. His friends roared with approval. She forced herself to eat a few bites of her sandwich, but the food sat like a stone in her stomach. When her phone buzzed, she pulled it out to find a message from her mother asking how the day was going. Dakota typed quickly, "Fine, just eating. Everything's good." She hesitated before hitting send, but the thought of worrying her parents was worse than enduring the truth alone. The afternoon brought more of the same. In history class, Trevor whispered something about people needing to know their place, loud enough for her to hear, but soft enough to avoid the teacher's notice. Mason's looming presence in gym class was more than enough to make her uneasy. He didn't even need to say anything, just cracked his knuckles and grinned, while the ball seemed to accidentally slam her way more than once. The cruelty escalated gradually, not in ways that could be neatly captured or punished, but in a steady drip of humiliation that wore her down. By the time the final bell rang, her nerves were stretched taut. She hurried to her locker, keeping her eyes fixed straight ahead, but a wad of paper hit the back of her head before she reached it. Laughter echoed down the hall as she stooped to pick it up. She didn't open it, simply stuffed it into her backpack and shut the locker quickly. Her father's SUV was waiting outside. She climbed in, her expression carefully composed. "How was it today?" Chuck asked, his eyes on the road. "Fine," she said, the lie quick and practiced. He glanced at her, studying her face, but said nothing more. Instead, he drove home in silence, his mind turning over the possibilities, the unease from that morning tightening its grip. That evening, Dakota sat at the dining table, her books spread before her. She tried to concentrate on her assignments, but her eyes blurred over the words. Every sound from outside, the bark of a dog, the slam of a car door, made her flinch. She rubbed at her temples, feeling the pressure building. Upstairs, Chuck stood in the hallway outside her room, listening to the silence within. He remembered all the times he had been in hostile places, where silence meant danger. That same instinct gnawed at him now. The days that followed carved the pattern deeper. In the cafeteria, she became the target of flying food and whispered slurs. In the hallways, her path was blocked, her belongings tampered with. Teachers' eyes slid away, their silence as loud as the laughter of her tormentors. She grew quieter at home, her once easy smile replaced by weary glances and half-finished sentences. Chuck noticed everything. He had spent his life reading people fighters in the ring, soldiers in the field, strangers on the street, and he knew when someone was carrying weight too heavy for their shoulders. His daughter was no different. She tried to hide it, to stand tall as he had always taught her, but the cracks were showing. Late one evening, he found her at the kitchen table, her head bowed over her notebook, her hand clenched tightly around her pen. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up, forcing a small smile. "Just homework," she said quickly. He nodded, not pressing her, but in his heart, he knew. He could feel the storm gathering, could see the shadows lengthening around her. The bullying wasn't just idle cruelty anymore. It was escalating, growing bolder with every day they believed they were untouchable. And though Dakota tried to carry the burden in silence, Chuck's instincts told him the truth. Something was coming, something darker than taunts and pranks. And when it did, he would be ready. The tension between the bright facade of the town and the hidden malice festering within its walls had begun to tighten like a noose. The days ahead would demand more of both father and daughter than either could imagine. The rhythm of the days at Riverside High became almost unbearable for Dakota. What had started as occasional jabs and sly insults had now turned into a constant drumbeat of hostility, a steady rhythm that she could never quite escape. Each morning she walked through the double doors of the school with her head held high, her shoulders squared the way her father had taught her. But inside she felt as though she were walking into a battlefield. Every glance carried suspicion, every laugh behind her back seemed directed at her, and every step was shadowed by the presence of Brandon and his friends. One afternoon in the cafeteria, the cruelty reached a new level. Dakota had just sat down with her tray, her eyes fixed firmly on the sandwich she had brought from home. She barely noticed Brandon's group enter until a hush rippled through the tables around her. A moment later, a glob of mashed potatoes splattered across the table, sliding dangerously close to her lap. She froze, hearing the laughter burst from across the room. Brandon stood with his arms crossed, grinning triumphantly while Kyle and Mason howled at his side. "You missed," Trevor called, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. Brandon smirked. "Don't worry, I won't next time." He picked up another wad from his tray and hurled it straight at her. This time it hit her shoulder, the cold mess sliding down her sleeve. For a split second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Dakota looked down at the stain, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Every instinct told her to lash out, to scream, to throw the food back at them. But her father's voice rang in her head. "Stand tall." She rose from the table, her expression calm, and carried her tray to the trash without a word. Behind her, the laughter rose to deafening heights, echoing off the cafeteria walls. She walked into the hallway, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She couldn't let them see her cry. She leaned against her locker, trying to steady her breathing, when she heard the shuffle of footsteps. A younger girl stood a few feet away, clutching her books nervously. "I'm sorry about them," the girl whispered, her eyes darting toward the cafeteria. They do that to anyone who doesn't fit." Dakota's heart lifted slightly at the gesture. But before she could answer, Brandon's voice rang out from the doorway. "Careful, little mouse. You don't want to get caught talking to her. Might make you a target, too." The girl paled and hurried away, leaving Dakota standing alone. Brandon grinned, satisfied, before disappearing back inside. The hallway felt colder than ever, the isolation heavier than words could carry. At home that evening, she scrubbed at the stain on her sleeve, her jaw set tight. Chuck entered the kitchen, his brow furrowing as he saw the determination in her movements. "What happened?" he asked gently. "Nothing," she replied quickly. "Just spilled food." His eyes narrowed. He had been lied to before in his life, both in the field and in the ring, and he knew the signs. He wanted to push, to demand the truth, but he also knew his daughter was trying to carry something on her own shoulders. For now he let it go, but his mind cataloged the detail, storing it with the unease that had been building since their move. The following day, the tension ratcheted up once more. In the history classroom, Trevor's whispers grew bolder. "Some people don't belong here," he murmured, his words heavy with malice. "Some people should just learn their place." His eyes flicked toward Dakota, and a few students nearby snickered. She bit the inside of her cheek, determined not to react. But the sting of his words clung to her, heavier than the book she carried. Mason added his own cruelty during gym class, hurling the basketball at her, with just enough force to make her stumble. The teacher blew the whistle but didn't call him out by name. Instead, he muttered, "Be more careful, everyone," as though the blame rested equally on all. By the time she returned home, her body ached not from the physical blows, but from the exhaustion of constant vigilance. She closed her bedroom door, collapsing onto the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around her pillow. Silent tears finally slipped down her cheeks, hidden away where no one could see. She buried her face, ashamed not of her pain, but of her inability to stop it. Chuck noticed. He always noticed. Standing in the hallway, he heard the muffled sobs and felt his chest tighten. Memories surged back, missions where silence hid danger, fights where hesitation meant defeat. He hated the sound of her suffering more than anything he had faced in his life, but he also knew that stepping in too soon could strip her of her own strength, the resilience she needed to grow. Still, every instinct screamed at him to protect her. He returned to his study that night, pacing the floor with restless energy, his thoughts a storm he could not calm. The weekend brought no relief. When Monday arrived, Dakota tried once again to steel herself. But by now, her tormentors had grown bolder, emboldened by the silence of the adults around them. As she walked into the cafeteria, Brandon and his gang blocked her path. "Careful not to trip," Mason said with a grin, sticking out his foot. She sidestepped him, but Kyle's hand shot out, sending her books scattering across the floor. Pages fluttered everywhere like broken wings. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Students stared but didn't move to help. Dakota crouched down, gathering her things, her hands trembling. Brandon bent low, his smirk inches from her face. "See, Norris? You don't belong here. You're just another name, another face we can crush whenever we feel like it." Her chest heaved, rage boiling just beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make them pay for every wound they had inflicted. But instead she gathered her books with deliberate slowness, rose to her feet, and walked past them. Her silence was her defiance, though inside it felt like defeat. Later that night she sat on the porch, staring into the darkening sky. Her father joined her, lowering himself onto the step beside her. He didn't speak at first, just sat in quiet companionship. Finally he asked, "Want to tell me what's really going on?" She shook her head, her throat tight. "It's fine, Dad. I can handle it." He studied her profile, the way the fading light caught the determination in her eyes. "Handling it doesn't mean carrying it alone," he said softly. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke louder than words. Inside, Chuck's unease grew into certainty. He had lived too long to ignore his instincts. Something darker was building, something more dangerous than simple bullying. The line between childish cruelty and real harm was thinning, and he could feel it snapping under the strain. The days that followed proved him right. The group's actions became sharper, more public, their laughter more cutting. They no longer feared being caught because they knew no one would stop them. Teachers avoided confrontation, students avoided eye contact, and the silence of authority gave Brandon and his friends free rein. For Dakota, every day felt like a test of endurance, a balancing act on the edge of patience. She clung to her father's lessons, to the strength he had instilled in her since childhood, but she could feel herself nearing the breaking point. Each insult, each shove, each laugh pushed her closer to the edge. Chuck saw it in her eyes each evening when she returned home. He had seen soldiers on the verge of collapse, fighters one punch away from breaking, and he recognized the same flicker of exhaustion in his daughter. He began watching more closely, listening for the signals, preparing himself for what he knew was coming. The storm had not yet broken, but the clouds were gathering thicker, darker, heavier with every passing day. And when it finally unleashed its fury, neither father nor daughter would be able to ignore it any longer. The weeks of torment had ground down every part of Dakota's resolve, yet she refused to let her tormentors see her break. Each morning she stepped through the school doors with her head high, determined to hide the cracks forming beneath the surface. But inside she was exhausted. The laughter, the whispers, the shoves in the hallway, the way even teachers looked away, all of it had become an unrelenting storm pressing down on her shoulders. Her patience had stretched to its very limit, thin as glass ready to shatter. Chuck had seen the signs. He knew the way her eyes lingered on the floor when he asked about her day, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. But she told him again and again that she was fine, and he forced himself to wait, though every instinct screamed at him to act. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when the storm finally broke. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the emptying schoolyard as students drifted away. Dakota gathered her books slowly, her muscles aching from gym class, her heart heavy with the burden of another long day. She noticed the hallways were quieter than usual. The chatter of students gone, the silence settling in like a trap waiting to spring. She walked toward the doors, her footsteps echoing in the corridor, when she caught sight of Brandon leaning against the lockers just ahead. His smile was wrong, too wide, too patient, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Well, well," he drawled, pushing off the lockers. "Looks like you and I have some unfinished business." Before she could react, Kyle and Mason stepped out from the side hallway, blocking her path. Trevor appeared behind her, his hand clamping down on her shoulder. She twisted to pull away, but Mason's bulk loomed too close, cutting off her escape. The hallway was deserted, the teachers long gone to their cars, the last of the students already off the grounds. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. Brandon leaned close, his breath hot against her face. "I want everyone to know exactly who you are. Not the tough girl you pretend to be. Just another nobody who doesn't belong here." Trevor yanked her arms back while Kyle pulled a coil of rope from his backpack. The sight of it sent dread plunging into her stomach. She struggled, kicking at Mason, but his hands closed around her wrists like iron. The rope bit into her skin as they bound her hands together, their laughter echoing off the walls. "Stop it!" she shouted, thrashing against their grip. "Let me go!" But her words only fueled their amusement. Brandon glanced around the hallway, then jerked his head toward the back doors. "Come on, let's show her a real lesson." They dragged her through the doors and across the schoolyard, the fading light stretching their shadows across the pavement. Dakota dug her heels into the ground, but Mason shoved her forward, forcing her along. The trees at the edge of the property loomed darker than usual, their branches clawing at the sky as the sun dipped lower. The group moved quickly, pulling her toward one of the larger oaks that stood just beyond the playground. Brandon tossed the rope over a thick branch, his grin widening. "Perfect. Right here where everyone will see it tomorrow morning." Terror coursed through Dakota as they tied her to the tree, her arms bound tightly behind her, her back pressed against the rough bark. She winced as it scraped her skin, but she refused to cry. She glared at them, her chin lifted. "You think this makes you strong? You're pathetic." The insult stung, but Brandon only smirked. He stepped forward, delivering a sharp slap across her cheek that made her head snap to the side. "Pathetic? You'll see who's pathetic when the whole school watches you hanging here like a fool." The others jeered, their voices blending with the rustling leaves. Kyle pulled out his phone and began recording, the red light glowing as he focused on her face. "Say hi to everyone, Norris," he sneered. "This video's going viral." Her chest heaved with anger, but she pressed her lips together, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear. Mason jabbed a finger into her shoulder. Trevor laughed, and Brandon leaned in close again, his voice low and venomous. "Tomorrow, everyone will know you're nothing, and your old man won't be able to do a damn thing about it." The mention of her father sent a spark through her, a sudden burst of defiance. She stared into Brandon's eyes, her voice steady despite the pain. "You don't know my father." For the first time, his smirk faltered, but only for a second. He straightened and motioned for Kyle to keep recording. The boys circled her like vultures, mocking her, shoving her, their laughter growing louder with each insult. The rope cut deeper into her wrists, but she refused to cry out. She clung to the lessons Chuck had drilled into her since childhood discipline: patience, strength. But no lesson could erase the humiliation, the ache of being trapped and powerless, the knowledge that no one was coming to stop them. The minutes stretched painfully long, each second etched into her memory. She wondered how long they would keep her there, what else they might do before finally leaving. Her heart pounded, her breath came in ragged gasps, but still she refused to beg. And then in the distance came the faint crunch of gravel beneath tires. The sound grew louder, closer, until headlights briefly cut across the edge of the playground. Brandon's head snapped toward the light, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Damn it! Someone's here!" The SUV rolled into view, its familiar silhouette striking something deep inside Dakota's chest. Relief flooded her veins as she recognized it. Her father had come. He had found her. The boys shifted uneasily, their laughter faltering for the first time. Dakota's eyes filled with tears she had refused to shed, not of fear but of sudden hope. She straightened against the ropes, her heart surging with a strength she thought she had lost. Brandon cursed under his breath, signaling his friends to hold their ground. But deep down, even before Chuck Norris stepped out of the vehicle, they knew the game had just changed. And as Dakota's eyes locked onto her father's figure, moving swiftly across the yard, she realized that the nightmare was not hers to carry alone anymore. The storm that had been gathering was about to break, and the reckoning was close at hand. The boys' laughter had already begun to falter as the black SUV rolled to a stop near the playground. Its engine cut off, leaving a silence so heavy that even the rustling leaves seemed to still. Brandon swallowed hard, trying to keep his smirk, but his eyes betrayed the unease gnawing at him. Kyle lowered his phone slightly, his hand shaking, while Trevor shifted from foot to foot, casting nervous glances toward the approaching figure. Mason, the largest of the group, muttered something under his breath that no one caught. The door opened, and Chuck Norris stepped out. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to turn the air electric, charged with a force none of the boys could understand. He walked across the cracked asphalt with steady measured steps, his boots silent but his gaze sharp as steel. The fading sunlight caught the lines of his weathered face, the years of discipline and battle etched there like scars of wisdom. His eyes found Dakota immediately. Bound to the tree, her cheeks flushed from humiliation, her wrists red from the rope. She looked back at him with a mixture of relief and shame. She had tried so hard to be strong, to handle it on her own, but now she allowed herself to hope. "Dad," she whispered, the word muffled but carrying across the clearing. Chuck's jaw tightened. He didn't speak yet, his silence more terrifying than any shout could have been. His gaze swept over the four boys, assessing them the way he would enemies in a combat zone. He noted their stances, their nervous hands, the glint of the knife Brandon still held, the phone recording everything. His mind cataloged each detail with soldier's precision. Then he moved closer. Brandon forced a laugh, though it came out brittle. "Well, if it isn't the old man himself. Come to pick up your little princess?" His words trembled at the edges, and Chuck heard it clearly. "Untie her," Chuck said. His voice was low even, but it carried like thunder. Trevor stepped back instinctively. Kyle lowered the phone, his courage draining, but Brandon puffed out his chest, desperate to hold on to the last threads of control. "No, she needs to learn her place. We're just having some fun." He waved the knife slightly, though his hand trembled. "This isn't your world anymore, old man. You can't scare us." Chuck's eyes narrowed. He moved one step closer, his shadow falling across the boys. "You've made a mistake," he said, "and I'm here to correct it." The tension shattered. Brandon lunged forward, slashing with the knife, a wild and clumsy move born of panic more than skill. Chuck sidestepped with fluid grace, his hands snapping out to grip Brandon's wrist. With a precise twist, the knife clattered to the ground. Brandon cried out in pain, his knees buckling, and Chuck shoved him backward into the dirt. Mason roared, charging like a bull. He swung his massive arms, aiming to crush the man who had suddenly turned the tide. But Chuck pivoted, letting Mason's momentum carry him forward. His elbow struck Mason square in the chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Before the boy could recover, Chuck's leg swept his feet from beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground with a groan. Kyle dropped his phone, his courage evaporating. He tried to run, but Chuck's hands shot out, gripping his collar. He yanked the boy backward with one powerful motion and spun him around, pinning him against the tree beside his daughter. Kyle's eyes widened, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. Trevor, panicked and shaking, grabbed a broken branch from the ground and swung wildly. Chuck caught it midair, ripped it from his hands, and snapped it in two without breaking eye contact. Trevor stumbled backward, collapsing to the ground, his arms raised as if to shield himself from the storm bearing down on them. In less than 30 seconds, the clearing was transformed. Four boys who moments ago had felt invincible now sat or sprawled in the dirt, their arrogance crushed beneath the weight of reality. Chuck stood over them, his chest rising and falling slowly, his hands steady, his control absolute. He turned to his daughter. "Dakota," he said, his voice softening, "I'm here. You're safe." She blinked back tears as he moved to untie the ropes. His fingers worked quickly, unbinding her wrists, pulling the gag from her mouth. As soon as she was free, she threw her arms around him, clinging to him with all the strength left in her body. He held her close, his hand resting gently on the back of her head, his heart heavy with both relief and fury. "They were going to—" Her voice broke, the words lost in a sob. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "And they won't ever touch you again." When he finally released her, he turned back to the boys. They sat in a miserable row, bruised, frightened, their confidence stripped away. Brandon glared, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by the fear of a boy who had just seen the limits of his power. "You think being cruel makes you strong," Chuck said, his voice steady. "You think humiliating others gives you control. But real strength, real control, comes from discipline, from respect, from protecting those who can't protect themselves. You don't understand that yet, but you will." Mason groaned, clutching his ribs. Kyle sobbed quietly. Trevor wouldn't meet his eyes. Brandon tried to speak, but Chuck silenced him with a look so sharp it cut deeper than any blow could have. Chuck pulled out his phone and dialed. His words were simple, his tone icy. "This is Colonel Chuck Norris. I have 4 students here at Riverside High who just kidnapped and assaulted my daughter. Send units immediately." The boys froze. The weight of what was coming finally sank in. Their parents' money, their influence, their lies, all of it meant nothing now. The evidence was in Chuck's possession, the truth undeniable. Dakota sat beside him, her head resting against his arm. She felt safe for the first time in weeks, the terror finally loosening its grip. Yet even as relief washed over her, she knew this wasn't the end. The sheriff would try to protect them. Brandon's father would pull every string he had. But tonight had changed everything. Because tonight, Chuck Norris had made it clear. His daughter was not alone. And the storm he carried inside him was not one the town of Riverside would ever forget. The sound of approaching sirens soon pierced the night. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the trees as squad cars pulled into the clearing. Officers spilled out, hands on their weapons, their eyes widening at the sight before them. 4 beaten bullies, a girl freed from her ropes, and Chuck Norris standing tall, unyielding, like a sentinel guarding his child. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Chuck raised his chin. "They're yours," he said simply. The officers moved quickly, cuffing the boys, reading rights that none of them seemed to hear. Brandon protested, shouting that his father would fix everything, but his words rang hollow in the night air. Mason whimpered. Trevor cried. Kyle begged. The power had shifted irrevocably. As the boys were loaded into the cars, Dakota watched silently, her hand gripping her father's. She no longer felt the rope digging into her skin, no longer heard the laughter echoing in her ears. All she felt was the steady strength of the man beside her, the father who had come for her when she needed him most. Chuck looked down at her, his eyes softening. "It's over, honey." But in his heart, he knew it wasn't truly over. The fight had just begun. The sirens faded into the distance as the police cars carried the 4 boys away, their cries and protests drowned by the night. The clearing was left in silence once more, the fire smoldering low, casting faint embers against the bark of the tree where Dakota had been bound only minutes earlier. Chuck stood still, his hand on his daughter's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the trail where the vehicles had disappeared. He didn't speak, not yet. The air was thick with everything unsaid, the adrenaline still ebbing, the storm inside him settling into something colder, harder. Dakota leaned against him, exhausted, her body trembling from the shock of it all. She wanted to speak, to say something to break the weight of the silence, but no words seemed big enough for what had just happened. When they finally walked back to the SUV, Angela was already running down the driveway toward them. She must have followed when the sirens blared, unable to sit and wait. Her eyes were wide with terror until she saw Dakota safe. Then they flooded with tears of relief. She wrapped her daughter in her arms, rocking her as if she were a little girl again. "My baby," Angela whispered, her voice breaking. "You're safe now." Dakota clung to her mother, the sobs she had been holding back finally escaping her chest. Chuck watched them both, his heart swelling with pride for his daughter's strength and aching with the knowledge of how close he had come to losing her. They drove home slowly, the quiet inside the SUV filled only with the sound of the tires rolling over the gravel road. Dakota rested her head against the window, watching the shadows of trees blur past. Angela's hand never left hers, squeezing it every so often as if to make sure she was really there. Chuck's hands gripped the wheel firmly, his jaw clenched in silence. His mind was already moving ahead, anticipating the fight to come. He knew the Hayes family, knew the sheriff's corrupt allegiance, knew that the battle wasn't finished just because 4 boys were in custody. The true reckoning would be in daylight, in front of those who had hidden behind power and privilege for far too long. At home, Angela guided Dakota upstairs to change out of her torn clothes and wash the dirt from her face. Chuck went into his study, closing the door behind him. He pulled open the drawer of his desk and set out the evidence he had collected over the past weeks. Videos, photographs, copies of records, and now the confessions and footage from tonight. He worked methodically, piecing it together into something airtight, undeniable. He knew the sheriff would try to dismiss the charges, to brush it off as boys being boys. But this time, Chuck would not allow their voices to be silenced. He had fought too many battles, seen too many injustices ignored, to let it happen under his own roof. The next morning came heavy with anticipation. News spread quickly in a small town, and by the time the Norris family arrived at the courthouse, clusters of people had already gathered. Some were whispering, others openly staring, curiosity and fear written across their faces. Brandon's father, Councilman Richard Hayes, stood on the steps, his expensive suit immaculate, his expression smug despite the scandal brewing. Sheriff Wilkins lingered nearby, his face set in forced calm. But Chuck saw the flicker of unease in both their eyes when he approached, his daughter and wife at his side. Inside, the courtroom was tense. Teachers, parents, and students filled the benches, eager for answers, many of them secretly relieved that someone had finally dared to challenge the Hayes family. The 4 boys sat at the defense table, their arrogance stripped away, their heads lowered. Brandon's jaw was bruised, his arm bandaged from the twist that had disarmed him. Kyle's hands trembled as he fiddled with a pen. Mason winced every time he shifted, and Trevor avoided all eye contact, pale and hollow-eyed. They were no longer the untouchable bullies of the schoolyard. They were just boys, exposed, frightened, and facing consequences for the first time in their lives. When Chuck was called to testify, he walked to the front with the same calm, controlled gait that had carried him through battlefields. His voice was steady as he recounted the events, not exaggerating, not embellishing, simply stating the facts with precision. He described the harassment, the threats, the attack in the woods, and finally the ambush at the schoolyard. Every word struck like a hammer, deliberate and undeniable. When the defense tried to interrupt, he silenced them with a look that conveyed decades of discipline, of unshakable authority. And then he presented the evidence, the videos, the confessions, the recordings of Brandon boasting about his father's protection, the proof of cover-ups orchestrated by Sheriff Wilkins. The room shifted with each piece revealed. Gasps echoed, whispers spread, heads turned toward the councilman and the sheriff. Richard Hayes' smug expression began to crumble, sweat beading on his brow. Wilkins tried to remain impassive, but his hand twitched against the table, betraying his nerves. By the time Chuck finished, the weight of truth was crushing. It was no longer just about 4 boys bullying a girl. It was about a system rotten from the inside, exposed by the very man they had underestimated. When Dakota was called to the stand, she stood tall despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke of the whispers, the taunts, the loneliness of being targeted day after day. Her voice cracked when she described the rope cutting into her wrists, the cold fear of being left alone in the woods, the humiliation of hearing their laughter as they tied her to the tree. But she didn't cry this time. She spoke with a strength that surprised even her words clear and unwavering. When she finished, the room was silent, the weight of her courage settling over every person present. The judge delivered the verdict with solemnity. The boys were found guilty of assault, kidnapping, and hate crimes. They would serve time in juvenile detention, followed by years of probation and community service. But more than that, the evidence against Richard Hayes and Sheriff Wilkins was forwarded to state authorities. The councilman was stripped of his position, the sheriff arrested for corruption and obstruction of justice. The empire they had built on intimidation and deceit crumbled in a single day, undone by the truth they thought no one would dare to bring forward. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in murmurs and shouts. Some praised Chuck, others looked fearful, realizing the old power structure had been broken. But for the first time in years, people also looked at Dakota, not with pity or mockery, but with admiration. A few students approached her quietly, thanking her for standing up, apologizing for their silence before. Emma was there too, her eyes shining with tears as she hugged Dakota fiercely, no longer afraid to be seen by her side. That evening, the Norris family sat together in their living room. The weight that had hung over them for weeks was finally lifting. Angela leaned against Chuck, her hand entwined with his, while Dakota curled up on the couch with a blanket, her eyes heavy but peaceful. They didn't speak much, the silence between them now a comfort instead of a burden. Chuck looked at his daughter, pride swelling in his chest. She had endured humiliation, fear, and cruelty, and had emerged stronger, her dignity intact. She had faced the darkness and refused to let it break her. Later, when the town gathered for a community meeting, people spoke of change. Parents demanded better protections for their children. Teachers vowed to stand up rather than look away, and students formed new groups dedicated to kindness and accountability. The old ways were gone, and though rebuilding would take time, the foundation had shifted. And at the heart of it all was Dakota, a girl who had been tied to a tree and left to suffer, but who refused to be defined by that moment. She stood with her father by the very tree where it had all begun, now covered with flowers and ribbons placed there by classmates and neighbors. A small plaque had been added, engraved with words that made her throat tighten. Strength is standing tall, even when the world tries to break you. She touched the rough bark, no longer a symbol of fear, but of survival, of resilience. Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but steady. They thought they could silence you. They thought they could control you, but you proved them wrong. That's real strength. Dakota looked up at him, her eyes shining. I learned it from you. He smiled then, the kind of smile that came not from victory, but from knowing that something greater had been preserved. Justice had been served, the corrupt had fallen, and his daughter had discovered her own unshakable strength. The night air was cool, the stars bright above them, and for the first time in a long while, peace settled over the Norris family. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. But it wasn't the same. The town had changed, the school had changed, and Dakota had changed most of all. She carried herself differently now, not with the heaviness of someone burdened by cruelty, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced it and triumphed. The scars would remain, but they would be reminders of her strength, not her suffering, and always by her side was her father, the man who had taught her that no matter how dark the night, there was always light waiting to break through. For Chuck, the mission was complete, but the lesson lingered. He had fought countless battles in his life, but none as personal, none as vital as this one. Protecting his daughter had not just meant defeating her tormentors, it had meant giving her the courage to rise above them. And in that, he knew they had both won. If this story kept you hooked, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. More shocking stories are waiting for you right here. Click to watch the next video and dive even deeper. And if this video made you think, share it with your friends. Let's see how they react.